Hello and welcome to this recorded presentation. My name is Anne Robertson and I'm Head of Services and User Engagement at EDINA at the University of Edinburgh. I'm presenting today on a topic aimed at developing data literacy skills in our learners for tomorrow's data economy. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'd like to consider a number of areas. I'd like to provide a couple of live demonstrations looking at EDINA's Detonation service, particularly around how it could be used to develop data citizenship skills. I'll also be demonstrating our computational notebook service, Notable, again with an angle of looking at how it can be used to develop broader data science skills. Initially, I'd like to touch upon setting the scene within the Scottish context, looking at data science within the Scottish education curriculum. And my core theme for today is why, if you are considering teaching data skills to your students, then you should consider geospatial data as a really excellent resource for basing your teaching upon. So EDINA at the University of Edinburgh, we are a small business unit and we have a number of services that we deliver to predominantly the education sector. Our flagship service, digimap, is delivered to over 150 higher and further education colleges across Great Britain. We've delivered this service for 20 years now, and we have a number of different themes of geospatial data. So topographic data, historical data, aerial photography, geological data, marine data. And the types of users that consume this data are absolutely beyond the geography department. So we have students and lecturers in planning, environmental modelling, biology, architecture, even archaeology. So geospatial data can really appeal to a number of areas. One of the most recent additions to our service portfolio is our computational notebook service called Notable. Notable is a cloud-based computational notebook service, so it's a hassle-free way of rolling out Jupyter notebooks across an organisation, and it enables the automated setting of assignments and marking. And one of the short demonstrations I'll give this afternoon will look at a geospatial notebook, and again how that could be a really excellent example of developing data skills. I'd like to also explain that we deliver digimap not just into higher and further education institutions, but also to a large number of primary and secondary schools across Great Britain and increasingly internationally as well. We have schools in Dubai, Hong Kong, Kenya, Singapore, to name but a few, and they're using our digimap for schools service. Again, like our higher education service, it has a mix of geospatial data, topographical, historical, and aerial digital mapping. And again, it's a web-based service, so it's available for students, learners, teachers to use as long as they've got a browser and internet connectivity. And within the service we have some simple spatial analysis tools. I thought it really pertinent to share with you, we have a really dynamic, engaged social media presence within our digimap for Schools service. And even when we look at some of the examples of how teachers and schools are using the service, we start to see some experiences of digital learning, of the service being used beyond the geography department. So some of the Twitter images we have here are a very young learner sharing with his classmates the walk that he's made in his area. But interestingly, his teacher's tagging that in her tweet with digital learning. Another slightly older group working in pairs on laptops. Again, that linkage of the teacher interpreting it as computing and geography. And then in our final age group, in the larger image there, we can see older learners using digital mapping as a basis upon which to enhance and practice their debating skills. Teachers looking at engaged citizens. In this particular example, the students are looking at how to develop a piece of land, be it for farming, for tourism, for environmental energy. So, again, a nice broad basis upon which digital mapping is being used within our existing user base. And that's a nice segue for me to introduce gently the Scottish context to data skills. 2019 survey by Industries in Scotland on behalf of Skills Digital Scotland identified that over 50% of employers, when they were asked what were those emerging skills that they were looking for, over 50% referenced big data, data analytics. And that's a really interesting increase and a recognition that there's a real appetite and demand for employers for those joining the workforce to have data skills. And again, in the Scottish context, I thought it was really interesting to share with you a number of initiatives looking at developing data skills within learners within Scotland. So we have a data education in schools programme. It's an ambitious programme running for 8 years. It's based within our University of Edinburgh Murray House School of Education and Sport. And it's there to teach data literacy and data citizenship skills right across the learning age group, so from 3 to 18-year-olds. And associated with the Data Education Schools programme are Scottish Qualifications Authority, the organisation responsible for setting certification within Scotland, have developed the first school-based national qualification in data science, and colleagues in SQA have said that this really is the first in the world, where there's a range of different levels taught across schools. Most recently, in 2020, there has been an associated Professional Development Award created, and that's there to support CPD and teachers and also those coming back into the workforce. And there's also aspiration to deliver a higher national diploma in data science as well. And these broad advancements in data education within the Scottish context are underpinned by a very ambitious programme, a city region deal funding programme coming from UK government. And one of the pillars of that coming into Edinburgh and South East Scotland is the ambition for Edinburgh to become the data capital of Europe. So a large investment coming to the region. And quite correctly, there's recognition that it's really important to look right down to these earliest age groups and start developing skills in our youngest of learners, so that when they are reaching the age of higher education, further education, coming into the workforce, that these data skills are as developed as they can be. And again, from our Data Education in Schools programme coming out of Murray House, in terms of becoming a data citizen, there's 4 kind of broad areas, and I'd like to touch upon 3 of those today. The first is finding meaning in data, and I think that's such an important part of becoming a data citizen. It's about identifying patterns. It's about telling the story. It's about visualizing data and selecting what is the correct visualization of that data. And once one can understand patterns and visualizations, then that lends itself very well to becoming a critical consumer of data, questioning, applying that critical thinking. What does this mean for me? Is this reliable information I'm being provided? How could it be presented in a different way? What are the key statistical patterns or algorithms that have been applied to show me these trends? And finally, there's the taking the action based on data. Within the Scottish Curriculum of Excellence, we have this idea of a responsible citizen, of acting in the right way for the planet and for our global community. And that's such an interesting and important skill that we really would like to develop in our learners, about the confidence around taking action based on data. The fourth area, which I'm not going to touch upon today, but of course is a whole area in itself, is that personal data trail, that digital footprint. How am I representing myself within social media, online, etc.? But that's not the crux of today. I'm looking at the three other areas in terms of developing data skills. And I said in the introduction that what I really wanted to do was try and make the case today, make the case that geospatial data really are an excellent platform upon which data skills can be created, and engaged learning can be really engaging for young people. And I've pulled out a couple of examples from SQA's data citizenship unit at a particular level. And this is where they're giving teachers some examples. Think of examples that you could give students. And again, they talk about using real life examples with learners. And these two are absolutely explicitly geospatial in their nature. So in the first example, mapping a supermarket, bus routes, look at income levels and car ownership in a particular area, and then produce a report identifying where to place a new store. So clearly a geospatial example there. The second one again echoes those sentiments. Plan catchment areas for a school or plan a location for a new school. Consider demographic information. Identify suitable sites. Examine environmental impact. So even in our data science qualification, the examples that are being suggested for learners to engage in and carry out are geospatial in nature. And a review of the wider literature also suggests that geography, geospatial, mapping projects can be the most engaging way for young learners to understand and develop their data literacy skills. So in the first piece of work here from 2017, contemporary thought suggests teaching data literacy as a cross-curricular subject. Incorporating it into subjects such as science and geography is the most effective approach. In a second, slightly earlier piece of work coming out of New York, again, this concept of teaching data literacy to young people can be challenging because it can be quite difficult to contextualize. However, where you have youth-based mapping projects that focus on working with data about local social issues, then these can be engaging and have the desired impact of increasing data literacy skills. So I think we see there in the wider review and also within our Scottish data science examples, clearly there is a theme there that the geospatial data, geographic place examples can be the most engaging. And so that leads me on to what I'd like to present this afternoon is our Detonation service. And I'd like to make the case that this service is one which can be used as a wonderful platform to develop data skills. So I'll say a little bit about it and then we'll have a look at the service itself. Essentially, Detonation builds upon our expertise in developing digimap for schools. So it's got those same beautiful themes of data, historical mapping, aerial photography, ordnance survey mapping. But most importantly, we've added a number of big data, 2011 census data. So what one would recognise as big data sets, open data, freely available for anyone to interrogate and download from government official websites. But we've pre-prepared the visualization of this very tabular statistical census data. So EDINA and our team of geospatial experts have put in the work in terms of preparing the visualization. We've looked at the statistics, looked at the data, we've decided how best to represent it. And we've introduced for the user some really nice tools around charting and about being able to upload data, be that data that they've created themselves, which has a geospatial element, or open data that they may have discovered online. And there really is a wealth of open data. Such a push within the United Kingdom. We have location.gov.uk, we have data.gov.uk, where local authorities and government agencies are making data sets available. And by offering these features to learners, we are introducing them to the concept of data formatting, data cleansing. The data upload functions will work really well, but the data has to be structured and formatted for it to import correctly. And in terms of the end result, the visualization, we believe that Detonation supports that skill set of visualizing data, selecting what's the right method to visualize, and providing support and confidence in learners to start to tell stories around data, because essentially that's the skill we're looking to create. Looking at data, identifying patterns, and being able to create a narrative, tell a story about what is being seen in the data. And of course, it does that wonderful thing of encouraging critical thinking. If this, then that. If I'm seeing these trends, what does that mean? What's the underlying cause? How could I change that? Is this fair in society? So as a package, we think Detonation is a really excellent vehicle for developing data skills. And just before we go and have a look at the service, to highlight that the layers of data that we will look at, either the ones that come pre-populated from the 2011 census, or the ones that I add in, the house property data or the crime data, these have all started as either flat spreadsheets or comma delimited text files, so very flat based, numeracy based data, so quite dry, quite hard to interpret, and I hope you'll agree that when we look at it within the service, the data kind of comes to life. So I'll just come out of my presentation and switch into my browser here, and I'll come to our Detonation product here. So for any of those who are familiar with Digimap for Schools, you will know that we have this beautiful mapping stack. My favourites, without doubt, are these gorgeous 1890s mapping that we have across Great Britain. Such beautiful cartography on these maps. And learners can fade in and out. We can go from the 1890s to the 1950s, looking at the expansion of urban areas. Sometimes we see new towns forming. Sometimes we see a reduction in the branch railway network across Great Britain. And we also have some aerial imagery, again beautiful aerial imagery, which sometimes can be really beneficial for young learners if they're trying to understand where am I looking, what am I looking at in the world. What you can see clearly when one looks at Edinburgh, because I know the city very well, of course, is Murrayfield, where our national team plays rugby, and then we've got all these lovely golf courses out to the north and the west of the city as well. We've got Arthur's Seat over here with Holyrood Palace and the Meadows as well. Some of you might know the city and know the Meadows. So those are some features that I instantly recognise when I look at a map of Edinburgh. But we'll come back and we'll look at the Ordnance Survey mapping. Detonation. Let's just show you what we've done. I'll minimise that. We've introduced these wonderful layers from the 2011 census. And yes, 2011 does seem like quite a while ago, but the census is carried out in Great Britain only once a decade. We are approaching the 2021 census. Generally, it can take up to 4 years for the Office of National Statistics to process the data coming out of the census. Themes will come out quicker than others, but we fully intend, once some of the 2021 census data themes start appearing, to add them into Detonation. But for now, we've got 2011 census themes. So, really simple user interface that we can look at. For example, people living alone. So you can see, looking at the geographies, where we have these clusters of people living alone. So for every geography, I can click on the census area. This one is for Gorgie West, to the west of Edinburgh. We see the number of households, and we see the percentage of those households who are living alone. And these are the raw numbers from the census. One can at any time jump out to the official NOMIS website where the data has been downloaded from. So a teacher or a learner could go and download the data set themselves if they would like to look at the data set. But coming back to our Detonation interface, you can also see that as you zoom in, the census geographies themselves become far more smaller in their geography. They encompass a smaller number of households. We have 4 layers of census geography, and so as you zoom in, you're seeing a reduced number of households. In this census geography, Gorgie West, there are 589, of which 344 are one-person households. And we've introduced a nice function to be able to look at a chart. What does that mean? So of the one-person households in this area, a small percent are aged 65 and over. And you can compare that to any census geography around the area. Again, in terms of the one-person household, you can see here that it's really quite a large percent. We've got of the one-person households in this particular census geography area. And this is a question that you could then have with your learners. What does this mean? If there's a greater than 50% number of households where there's only one person, what does this mean for the ability to access new housing, drilling down and looking at the types of people that are making up these households, their ages, their types? What does that talk about amenities in the area? So you can start to have conversations around some of the themes that you're seeing. So we have people living alone. For example, we look at levels of qualification. So where are the areas, for example, in this part of Edinburgh where you have a high proportion of households where there's no formal qualification? And you can see some of these areas out here. This is Stenhouse and Saughton Mains, where there's quite a high proportion of people living where there's no qualification in the household. We've also introduced a little download function, so people could download just these raw numbers that they're looking at themselves. If you wish to set a challenge to a learner to chart the data, they could download the data from here into a little simple CSV file and add it into a spreadsheet. And so we have a number of themes: dependent children, age of population. We have an interesting theme looking at economic activity, employment or unemployment. Again, you would perhaps start to see some broad themes coming out of the city a little. It's very interesting to look at an area that one knows. There are some areas in the north of Edinburgh where unemployment is quite high, likewise out to the west of the city as well. Again, that area here, we're looking at Wester Hailes, where you have quite a high level of economically inactive individuals. And so what's wonderful here, we feel, is that we're showing the raw census data, but very much classified using census geographies. If I look at, say, for example, socially rented housing, just to highlight the level that you can get to, if we could keep zooming in, I hope that you're seeing this really clearly. The census geographies break down into incredible detail, and we can fade that in and out. So here you're actually seeing building footprints, building numbers, and how the census geography is created. So I could click on that census geography, and here you would see that there are 53 households, 23 of which are owned outright or in mortgage, those that are socially rented, privately rented. So we're going down to incredible detail. And these are the raw stats that you would get from the government website if you downloaded the data, but we're representing them geographically. We've brought together the geospatial boundary and merged that with the statistical data. And so, you know, we do believe that what you're seeing here is, when it's presented geographically, some wonderful patterns that you could ask your learners to interpret. I know, for example, that this very clear definitive line here is the railway line out to the west of Edinburgh that heads over to Glasgow, and you can see that separates the census areas, and it also really separates the types of neighbourhoods that we're looking at. So on the south side, sorry, I'll just bring that back on, the socially rented, to the south side of the railway versus on the north side of the railway, where we have a far, that's Kirkstofton South. You know, I know that's you know, not as deprived, nowhere near deprived as some of the areas on the south side of the railway. So just that instant visualization of data. And a couple of other layers, two other layers that I'd like to show you. So we focused upon 2011 census data. It's very statistical. There's a lot of numbers. We're representing it visually. But in terms of big data sets, there are data sets that are authoritative data sets based upon the census data, but which are represented by written descriptions as opposed to numbers. This particular classification is an official product created by the Office for National Statistics and University College London, based on the 2011 census data. It's a little bit colourful, but if you have a look on the left hand, the legend here, you can see some quite challenging language can be used. So the blues are constrained city dwellers. The yellows are hard-pressed living. We have urbanites, suburbanites, multicultural metropolitans, ethnicity central, cosmopolitans, rural residents. And what a fantastic narrative that you could go with your learners from, these are the numbers, this is what the census data tells you about your area of interest, your local neighbourhood, but what does it really mean to live here? What are the characteristics? What is the character of this local area? And so if I choose perhaps one of the, this particular area, which is coloured by the hard-pressed living, we can see it's a three-tiered description, and this is described as houses living in this area, if we zoom in, characterised by hard-pressed rented terraces, members of the challenged terraced workers who are members of the hard-pressed living group. Quite a stark description, you know, and again, one could engage with one learners and say, do you recognise that? Perhaps let's take one of the blue areas. So these are described as transitional Eastern European neighbourhoods, members of the challenged diversity constrained city dwellers group. You know, even a discussion around the language used here, the text itself would be I think a really fantastic one to have with your learners. You've gone from the numbers, you've visualised the data, now look at this large data set, and be sure this sort of data is used by companies, you know, your insurance companies, your banking companies, etc. But it is an official data product, and it will be recreated in the 2021 census as well. Another data product, before we look at pulling in your own data, that I really like it. Now this is an academic census data product, so it's not authoritative from the Office of National Statistics, but it's really, really interesting. And this is our internet user classification. Again, I'll just open the browser there and reference a paper it created. This data product was created by the University of Liverpool. And I'm just going to scroll here. You can see some of the descriptions, and if we come back into the data set, and these are how engaged people are with the internet. And again, some wonderful language being used here. So e-cultural creators, digital seniors, the e-withdrawn, the e-veterans, the e-rational utilitarians. I mean, just some wonderful language. And again, I would welcome or certainly suggest the youthful urban fringe. Have a look, have a look in the, let's have a little bit look about what the youthful urban fringe is described as. That's the e-professionals, the e-veterans, the youthful urban fringe. Just see if this chimes with anyone. This group often resides at the edge of city centres. They're often young and drawn from ethnic minorities. They can include a mixture of students and other young urbanites living in informal households, often at the edges of materially deprived communities. Access through desktop devices is low, suggesting a young and mobile profile of individuals. Just excellent. High levels of social media usage, but low patronage of online retailing. Really interesting. So I love that data set, and I'd strongly recommend you having a little look at that. Okay, but what I'd like to do now is, I did say that I was going to show you how you can import data and look at data skills. So if we go to adding our own data, and I have pre-prepared something here, so I'm going to jump to Derby in England, because I've downloaded some data for areas of Derby. What I must do is turn off, for now, the internet user classification data, because that's going to make things look messy. And I'm going to choose a file to upload. I've got some police data and I've got some property data. If I look at, I've got my stop and search. So just before I go any further, I've downloaded this data. I'll just jump back. So I've downloaded this data from datapolice.uk. Wonderful. Anyone can go on here and download data for any of the particular police authorities. And you can get stop and search data, get a variety of types of crimes in CSV files. I would encourage you to go and have a play. You can set time ranges, etc. It's a really interesting source of data you can go and look at. So if I choose my file, I was going to look at stop and search data because I thought that was quite interesting in terms of the narrative, the learning and the critical thinking that one could have with one's pupils. And again, remember, these are CSV files, they're flat files, so it's a case of your pupils would probably look at them perhaps in Excel and understand the type of information contained in the file before then deciding how they would like to present it on the map. So if I import this data set, it's jumped me out a little because it covers a little bit more than Derby. I've been a bit zealous with the geographic extent. So if I come back into Derby, here we go. And you can see some of the stop and search data. You see the clustering around the city centre. And what we're going to do, for example, is look at how to classify the data. So currently everything's in as points, but we know that there's particular columns of data, and these are the types of information you can get: the name of the policing operation, the gender of the person who was stopped and searched, the age range, the defined ethnicity from the person who was stopped and searched, and you also have the officer defined ethnicity. These are interesting attributes to look at. I decided to look at age range to give myself just a decent classification. So with Detonation, it provides a default point symbol, and the age ranges, there are 3 age ranges from 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and over 34. And you could have a discussion with your pupils, what age range do you think would be most prevalent for stop and search? If we come into the city centre a little bit more, sorry, sometimes what I'm going to do actually is possibly just turn on the aerial photography, because yes, that just makes it look a little bit better. And of course, remember, you can interrogate this, look at these factors also with the historical data as well. Can you see any trends? Was there anything in how Derby was presented in the 1890s that reflects how it looks today? Really interesting discussion. But for the purposes of this, we're going to use the aerial imagery. And you can see that, yes, certainly the most prevalent age group there are the diamonds, the 18 to 24s, and they're probably sitting, in the city centre. And then if one thinks of, well, thinking back to that internet usage classification, is there any pattern with, for example, the internet user definitions? And I think you could probably say, yes, I can see that. I can see that they're clustering in the city centre, and they're clustering in that kind of pinky purple area. And interestingly, that area around here looks at the e-withdrawn and the youthful urban fringe. And if we think of those descriptions, we didn't look at e-withdrawn, but let's have a look at the e-withdrawn description. I think coming back up, it was early on in the definition, the e-withdrawn. Oh, it's not, it's number 10. Sorry, folks, I'll just move right down. Digital seniors. The group of e-withdrawn, here we go. They're least engaged with the internet, deprived neighbourhoods of urban regions. Socioeconomic profiles characterised by less affluent white British individuals or areas of high ethnic diversity. It has the highest rate of unemployment and social housing. Really interesting, because then one could look at, okay, we've got ethnicity within the data set as well. So we could come back here and we could say, okay, let's have a look at perhaps the officer or the self-defined ethnicity as well. So when you start to overlay different data and look at different products, you can really engage your learners in some critical thinking. So that was stop and search data. Just for the benefits of time, I'm going to clear that data set and turn off the internet user classification, and I'm going to jump back and bring in another file which I thought was interesting to look at, which was the data from the UK Land Registry. So I've created a really nice data set here looking at Derby house prices. So if we import this data set, and this might take a little longer because it's a little bit heavier. This data set has postcode attribute data within it, and we've merged the data. Again, we've just jumped out a little bit from Derby because it is quite a large data set, so I'm going to zoom myself back in. There we go. I just perhaps come out a little. Oh, sorry. Okay. And you can see that it's point data, and the points, probably when it's postcode data, the points will be represented in the middle of the postcode. So it might be quite interesting, because it's postcode data, to look at the areas, the postcode areas, and that starts to give a better visual presentation. And what I wanted to show here was, again, thinking of those data skills, is again, knowing that the attribute data we have has price, because that's what you're interested in, the average of the price paid. So if we just take the raw average of price paid across the postcode areas, you can see that it's quite colourful, because obviously you're going to have prices falling into every possible band of price. And this is where you could have a conversation with your pupils around, well, how could you better tell the story about house prices? And you could introduce that concept of grouping the pricing of the data. So a statistical process of grouping. So perhaps you could create quintiles. So looking at the maximum range from the smallest to the largest value, and then breaking it down into, say, for example, 5 different bands. And you could do that in your spreadsheet, and then That's something that we've pre-prepared here. And so when you ask it to look at to represent the data according to quintile, you can see that there's less colours used. And I'm just trying to get myself a really nice geographic extent to look at here to show. Coming back into the city centre here, because I know this is the city centre. Yep. Again, yes. So the orange colour is the 5th percentile, where the lowest band of pricing, and you wouldn't have seen that if you were just colouring it on every individual price. And again, the ones are the most expensive prices, and you start to see those as you move out of the city centre. And again, perhaps if one goes to the some of these economic indicators here, where we perhaps have, let's think of one of the skill set, perhaps the unemployment level. Yes, you see a broad pattern there of the orange colour occurring where there's higher unemployment. So again, that's visually confirming some of those trends that you've seen. And again, for your learners, if you're from Derby and you're looking at this area, that can be really engaging. You know, I mean, one of the other triggers here is looking at some of those internet type layers. We've also got broadband availability, and that talks about the availability of broadband in the area, and that kind of changes the pattern, because you think, well, I can clearly see actually that the darker colours where there is good broadband availability is in the city centre, yet that is where some of those withdrawn individuals are located, where there's, you know, lower property prices, higher crime rate in youths. You know, why is that? So, you know, some of the arguments that you may, or some of the critical thinking you may ask your learners to commence the journey on is, well, you know, even though the government or broadband providers might invest in city centres, does that in itself lift individuals out of poverty? And what a wonderful discussion you could have around that. So listen, that's a really whirlwind tour through Detonation, but I hope you've enjoyed that. I've got just a couple more slides and just a couple of examples that I would like to share with you before we finish. But what I did want to say before we move away from Detonation is that I hope you would agree with me that taking that geospatial perspective is such an excellent source of developing data citizenship skills. I'm using the term data citizenship to reflect the broad themes within the data education in schools programme coming out of Murray House. Visualisation, storytelling, becoming an informed citizen, making decisions based on data, being confident to interrogate data and question if what you're looking at is real, identifying patterns, and understanding that there's a lot of open data out there and different formats of data. And I hope you would agree that it's much more engaging to go from a flat representation of data in columns and rows and then looking at it spatially. One final little demonstration that I wanted to share with you is where that vision is, I think, for more comprehensive data science skills, you know, looking at coding. And again, this is something that if we develop these skills early on in our learners, the idea of coding and manipulating data with code that a learner has written themselves, that becomes more prevalent in a younger age group. And what I'd like to do is use an open source data product. This is an open source data repository that anyone can download from GitHub. Today it was in the news, regrettably, for all the wrong reasons. And it's Johns Hopkins University, their COVID-19 data repository, which is open source, collecting data from 180 different countries around the world on the occurrence of COVID deaths. And regrettably, it's reached over 1 million today. So that's not something that we should be pleased with, but I thought it was a really pertinent example to share this with us. And this example has been developed by a student who carried out an internship with us over summer at EDINA. So what I'd like to do again is come back out to my browser and come to our Notable service. This is our computational notebook service. And I'm going to start a geoscience notebook. So while that's starting, just to explain that Notable is a computational notebook cloud-based service, so it's running in the cloud like digimap for schools and Detonation. You only need access to a browser. And I'm going to open this particular notebook here that I have pre-prepared. I'm going to run through it quite quickly, but essentially I'm going to share with you the code that our intern has written to do everything. Go to GitHub, download the data in a CSV file, clean the data, and then present the data in a mapping interface. And it's this complete approach from data coding that I think is the real crux of the data science skillship, is understanding what the correct presentation of the data could be. So I'm just going to run through each cell that I have here that our intern developed. Here she's importing the different libraries that are required to actually create the end product. Here we're pulling in the geography from OpenStreetMap to create the world map, and we're creating the map here. Here we are pre-processing the COVID data. We're going out to the GitHub repository and pulling in the data, and it's updated every single day. So it's very live data. And then we do some cleaning. We've got to sort out, tidy up the names. Sometimes countries upload data according to states or territories within a country, but we're looking at country level data. And this is live code that's running here to do a little bit of cleaning. Keep going, keep going. And the next stage is to create a very simple choropleth map of the data. And if I scroll back here, because I've jumped down too quickly. So here we have the choropleth map. But of course, this is not taking on board the population, the proportion of COVID with population. So we need to do more than just a choropleth map. This is showing raw numbers, and in fact we have a date picker, and hopefully I ran this yesterday, which was the 28th, but so I'm going to try data from the 27th of September. And yes, we can zoom in a little, and we've got the representation of the data happening here. That was the first one. Because we're looking at more than just the raw numbers, we have to take on board the population. What do the COVID numbers look like against the population of the country? And so our student decided to introduce code to create a logarithmic map. We come here, so it's a different perspective. You can see a much better representation. And again, we could bring that forward, I think, for September. Yeah. And then moving down, again, I'll just keep running. Our student decided, well, that's all very well, but I'm still not exposing the numbers. I'm showing a more informative map, but I'd actually like to allow the user of my map to be able to see the numbers. How should I do that? And so again, if we just change the date here and we zoom in a little, then our student decided to actually use a hover tool. It's a little widget that comes with the mapping toolkit the mapping library that she's decided to use. And that gives, that fabulous little hover over. And so that's a really simple example, but it shows you that this is a student taking a really, really well-known open source data repository from Johns Hopkins University and writing code to create a visualization themselves and deciding upon the correct visualization and how to represent that data. And they decided to represent it, on a map. Of course, it lends itself to a map and that geospatial perspective. And that leads me just to my final slide, and it's one that I hoped I could leave as a sort of a final point in terms of what we're trying to create in our learners tomorrow. And it's really coincidental. I had prepared this presentation some weeks back, but last week Time magazine published its 2020 most influential people, and in that list of the 100 most influential people, Time magazine named Professor Lauren Gardner. And Professor Lauren Gardner is the person who is behind the Johns Hopkins Data Repository. Lauren's vision, working with her team within her department, created the COVID-19 map that you see here on my screen, and it's one of the most frequently visited websites in the world right now. And I wanted to read to you what was said about Lauren, and in terms of if we as educational providers, developing data literacy skills in our young people. I thought this was a really inspiring final thought. Lauren democratized data and filled a void of public health leadership. Lives will be saved because of her proactive work. The data she's made available has enabled a more nuanced understanding of its toll, such as illuminating significant disparities in confirmed cases and disease outcomes that are now solidified in the national conversation about racial and economic inequality. In the face of an existential threat, Lauren took action. She didn't wait for others. She stepped up first. And I think that really just epitomizes our aspiration to create tomorrow's data citizens, for them to be informed, for them to question data, think of the right representation of data. I think there could be no more inspiring role model than Professor Lauren Gardner and her action to take data that was being disparate around the globe, bringing it together, creating a repository, encouraging nation states to deposit their data there, and processing that data and showing to the rest of the world the pattern and the trends that were becoming evident as the pandemic spread. Wonderful. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation this afternoon. If anybody would like any information about Detonation, if they'd like to have trial access to the service, please contact me. My email's on the slide, so is the EDINA email. Likewise, if anyone's interested in our Notable cloud-based computational notebook service, I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you.